We're particularly honored today to welcome Emily Oster for this conversation and Q&A. So let me give you a little bit of information about Emily. In addition to being a professor of economics at Brown, Emily is the founder and CEO of ParentData, which is a service that provides a data-driven guide through pregnancy and parenthood. She's given countless parents the knowledge to confidently make informed decisions, and her newsletter now has hundreds of thousands of subscribers and a very tight-knit internet community. Emily's first book, Expecting Better, challenges conventional pregnancy customs, taboos, and norms, giving parents the information they need to make the best decisions for their own pregnancies. Next came Crib Sheet, her second book, which brings the same data-driven approach to tackle the early years of parenting. And then in A Family Firm, a data-driven guide to better decision-making in the early school years, she focuses on parental relationships with school-age kids. Emily has been featured on many shows, including The Daily Show, which was one of my favorite moments, and PBS NewsHour. I should also mention that Emily just happens to be one of my closest and dearest friends. So we met in college. She was a bridesmaid at my wedding, and I got pregnant only a few months after Emily did, and I started going to her with my questions instead of my doctor. And although I may have been the first to do this, I am not the only one anymore. Lots and lots of people are going to Emily to get their answers, and we will have time for all of you to pose your questions so that you can get your answers from her too. We are just delighted to have her here. Please join me in welcoming Emily.
Thanks, Jane.
You're welcome. So this is fun. So I would like to start because I have more background knowledge than the audience, but I thought maybe we could start by just asking you about your journey in the sense of where you came from being trained as an economist and then turning to write books for a much more popular audience. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what motivated you to start writing books and how has your training shaped your approach to trying to write to a more general audience.
Sure. So first of all, thank you guys all for coming, and thank you to Jane and the decision. This is like such a treat to get to do this, and it's especially a treat to get to do this with you. So thanks for hosting. So I'm trained as an economist. I love data, I love economics. My parents were economists, I'm married to an economist. It's a whole situation. And we really have always tried to engage with decision-making about life through that lens of sort of thinking about data and thinking about what are the risks and benefits and how do we trade off. Like that's how my brain works, that's how my family works. And when I got pregnant in 2010, I sort of assumed that is how it would work too. I had a kind of expectation that like I would take the same kind of, I don't know, like spreadsheet data-oriented knowledge that I took to like house buying, and it would like go into my pregnancy. And I think the sort of one big moment was this sort of realization like that wasn't how it was working. That wasn't how the books were. That wasn't like existing books, and that wasn't really how my medical experience was. And I spent a lot of my pregnancy and yours thinking about, what does the data say about this question about, like what kind of prenatal testing should we have, and what kind of birth do I want to have, and so that was the origin of like what made me excited about this. And the other thing that's probably useful is I really like writing. I like doing economics, I like doing data stuff, but I also really like writing, and I really like the challenge of or the interest in like trying to write about research for an audience that is not steeped in that. When we are academics, we spend a lot of time in an audience of academics with jargon and with kind of an audience who really speaks our language, and the translational challenge of kind of taking that and then saying like, how can I help people engage with this even though they don't have a PhD in this? And so I like that challenge, and I sort of, at some point in the middle of my pregnancy, and this part is a little bit fuzzy because of pregnancy brain, I sort of thought, okay, I'm gonna like take the things I like to do, I'm doing all this research, maybe I could write about it, I'm gonna write about it, and then it sort of turned into this book proposal, and then later there were some books, and now we find ourselves here.
You set up one of my other questions really well, actually two, so I'm gonna have to decide. So one of your gifts is being able to translate these really complex ideas about data for an audience that isn't very sophisticated necessarily about research and statistics and things of that sort. what do you have in mind as sort of some of the key ideas that you think everybody needs to keep in mind when either a new study comes out, or probably more likely it's like the headline comes out and there is some information behind it, but you don't know what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's basically two things, and when I sort of spend a tremendous amount of time on like Instagram, like talking people down from panic headlines, and there's kind of like two pieces. So one is just correlation is not causation. An enormous share of the kind of panic headline on the internet is like, you know, we have two groups of kids. One of them watched 5 hours of TV a day before they were 1, and the other group never watched any TV, and they turned out different, and it must be the TV. And you're like, come on, guys, like, please. And so there's a sort of like correlation is not causation that I repeat over and over and over again. I think the other piece that I often want people to recognize is the sort of headline about data is almost always like new study shows, with the sort of implication that like, now we're going to use this piece of information. Now this is our leading piece of information. And that's almost never true. Like on all of these questions, there's a bunch that came before it. And I often want people to sort of stop before the headline. Like before you read about the new study, make sure you know about the old studies. And then you can like incorporate this rather than just saying like, this is the one piece of information I need to know, because usually that's not true and that's often not helpful. So those are like the two. And then like look at the appendix tables, but that's a more niche. It's like a more niche comment.
Yes. The other thing that you queued up in my mind from your first answer was that I can specifically remember during my first pregnancy deciding to eat deli meats because you told me it was going to be okay,
Yeah.
or at least, you know, and I don't think I would have felt comfortable doing that if not for you showing me the data that compared, you know, you can avoid the deli meats, but you're going to have to avoid the lettuce too, and then it became, you know, all right, deli meats it is. I was curious whether you yourself can point to specific different choices that you made over the years because of the data that you found, like that you changed the approach that you would have taken.
Yeah, so I think there were many things like that in pregnancy, in part because I was doing all of this research like in the service of, like there are specific things even in this book where like I did the research for me, but some of them I did for you, like for reals. And so there are sort of, pregnancy was kind of all about that. I think one that comes to mind, in like by the time I was writing Crib Sheet, I was on my second kid, and so I had like made many mistakes already with the first one that I was working on rectifying. But the one thing that came out there was I sort of spent a lot of time on like toddler discipline and sort of like thinking about what kind of, I don't know, anyway, I ended up reading all about sort of 1, 2, 3 magic and thinking about consequences versus and that was like one place where I wrote the chapter and then I brought it to Jesse and I was like, I wrote this and like let's change how we're doing it because I think actually this would be a better approach. Oh, so that was like one.
One theme that runs through almost all your books, I would say, is that individuals and families don't necessarily have the same preferences, the same goals, the same constraints, the same tolerance for risk, whatever the case may be. And yet you still want people to be able to rely on research and data to make their decisions in an informed way. And so I'm curious, how can people do that given all of the differences across? And then my follow-up is that I'm curious whether there's anything that you would sort of say universal, like any advice that you ever give universally.
Okay, I'll come back to the second one. I mean, I think there are two things that are really hard about kind of incorporating preferences. So like to sort of set the stage, I generally think like the right way to make most of these hard parenting decisions is to like think about your question, figure out what the information is, like what's the data that I need, and then combine that with your preferences to make some choice. And depending on what your preferences are, that means the same data is not necessarily going to lead to the same choices, and like that's fine. I think what's very hard is when you make a choice and then someone else is like, why did you make this stupid choice? And it's hard, you know, it's hard at the playground, it's harder if it's like your mom or your mother-in-law or, you know, and so sort of there's this challenge of like holding in your head, like I made the choice that's best for me, and that is not the best choice for someone else. And it's hard to like not, it's hard to take it if someone, but it's also hard not to judge other people. Yeah. You know, and it's sort of, and it's hard not to be bossy. I don't know. So it's hard because you're sort of like, you think even if it's coming from a good place, it's like you want to not you don't want to boss other people, but of course you do want to boss other people. It's like, so this is like this is something that I think about a lot, is how to be careful not to tell people what they should do. And I think it's gotten, like, even from the position that I'm in now, a lot of people are just like, just tell me what you did. Like, I trust you, like, I like your books, like, just tell me what you did. And I actually am, like, quite careful about not being like, I can tell you it, but, like, it's not important, because it's not actually necessarily what you should do. Is there anything that you should definitely do? Yes, it is introduce allergens to your child early. But, like, that's like there's nothing like, that's like, okay, and then, like, no one's like, oh, I don't want to do, it's like, yes, that's something you should do, but that's not there's nothing like big.
Yeah.
There's nothing big and contentious where I would say the data is very clear or very obvious.
Your answer is reminding me of one piece of data that you did do in this early thing, was looking at, natural childbirth versus
I was
epidural.
gonna bring this up. I didn't know if you wanted me to bring
and
it up.
all of these things. And so we looked at the very same data, and Emily decided to go the natural birth route. And I am the Jane in the book that says, you're crazy.
Yeah.
Because I looked at that very same information.
No, it's like the day after you had your kid. You called me and you were like, you're crazy. You were like, you're so stupid. The epidural was amazing. Like, okay.
I was a big fan. Big fan of the epidural. So much so that I had a specific preference. I'm probably the first who's ever gone in, and I was like, no, I already know which one I want.
No, and it was beforehand. You were like, what if it doesn't work? How should I prepare for it? I was like, well, it almost always works. You were like, but what if it doesn't? I really need it. I was like, it's okay.
So different preferences, right?
Different preferences.
Pain, yes. You run all the time. That's
it's like an endurance sport.
Exists, exactly.
You don't like endurance
I don't
sports.
like endurance sports.
It's not for you.
No. So your work sometimes challenges conventional wisdom. And I was curious if you could share some of the examples of where you've come to a different conclusion than what conventional wisdom may have been, and how you respond to critics who don't like moving away from conventional wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few, like in the context of pregnancy, the thing that would sort of alcohol and like the occasional drinking during pregnancy was the thing that was most controversial when that book came out. When Crib Sheet came out, I think the most controversial thing was this sort of like breastfeeding is not necessarily the most important thing that ever happened and is not going to lead to all, like many of the benefits of breastfeeding are overstated. And those were both things that in their own way came with a fair amount of pushback. And I think one of the things I learned quite a lot over time is sort of how do you talk about complicated stuff like that with nuance, without, with sort of making it clear like why that is my read of the data and what it is that I saw in the data that challenged the wisdom, and why I think that the existing conclusions are not correct in many of those cases, while at the same time sort of acknowledging like some of the things that have come before. And so there's like a kind of, I've learned over time a little more about how to talk about that. I think when you talk about stuff like this, of course, there's a fair amount of pushback in various ways, and there are pieces of that pushback that I think are very important. I think it is really valuable, and I've learned much more over time to sort of like hear out like, the doctors that don't agree with me, or, researchers that said, like, I have a different read of this data, like, we can engage on, like, how much omitted variable bias do you think there is in this study? And, like, I have a perspective about reverse causality, and you have a perspective, we can, like, come together. I think the piece of it that's very frustrating for me that I've never really managed to get sort of past is the credentialing piece, is the sort of piece where people are like, I don't think you should be able to engage in these questions because you are not a doctor. And I think that's, I don't like that.
Yeah, or the wrong kind of doctor anyway.
Yeah, the wrong kind of, I mean, I'm not a real, let's not kid, I'm not a real doctor, but this sort of feeling of like, I have a particular kind of expertise, and we could come together on facts and talk about the substance on which we disagree, but it's very hard to hear like, I just don't think you should be able to comment on this because like you don't have these letters after your name.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right. Well, let me move to a question where you should be. This is your wheelhouse, not theirs. This is yours.
Okay.
When you discuss research, you sometimes explain why the data isn't as good as it needs to be to come to the conclusion either that they came to or the conclusion you might want to come to, anything like that. And so I was curious if there are any topics that you feel are just, that if you could direct research, that you would direct people to particular topics that you don't think have been explored well enough?
So I think there's I mean, I always want more research on every tiny topic. I think there's like two spaces. So one is, I think in women's health, we have under-researched people's experiences. So when we do research, and this is like an inherent feature of like research, we tend to like things where we can measure the outcome. So, like, is it like readmission to the hospital? Is it, this kind of, like something, like medical stuff tends to be easy to measure, but we don't often have good ways to measure like sort of how happy is someone, basically. And so I think I wish we had a better, almost, it's not so much a topic, but I wish we had a better system. Like I would like to be able to say, like, how are we collecting information about how people are doing, like in those first months after their kid is born, and what are the things we could do to make them, not to make them not show up at the hospital. Like, yeah, it would be great to not have people show up back at the hospital, but like, how are we figuring out how to support people so they are like happy and so they feel, comfortable and they feel confident, or like, we don't know how to measure that stuff, and I would like more outcomes there. I think in the same vein, the other thing that would be great is to understand better the role of parenting in like kids' success. That sounds like a really vague, but there's a sort of policy question here, which is like, by the time kids show up at school, at kindergarten, we see enormous socioeconomic differences in like how kids are doing. And so there's something happening between 0 and 5, and I think some of it is about parenting, and I don't think we really could say what it is. Mm-hmm. Like, what are people doing differently? And that feels like a very rich research space.
Mm-hmm. My follow-up question was sort of, maybe it's for one of these topics or maybe it's something else. If you could have the resources and buy-in to run just a study that tackled something in a way that we haven't been able to yet, maybe trying to get around the causation and correlation confusion that people have, or something like that. Is there a study that you wish, like, even if it's like, maybe practically it's impossible, but in theory, this would help us answer something that you feel like we currently either don't know much about it, or we are drawing our conclusions from the wrong type of data?
I'd like to do a randomized study on supplements because I think they're stupid. And so if I had like an unlimited, I'm sorry, this is like a very narrow, but like, I think if I had an unlimited budget, I would just randomize a ton of people into these like ridiculous supplements and then I would just show that they didn't matter. Mm-hmm. But it needs big, because you need to be really powered to like reject, small numbers.
Yeah.
So that's for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You primarily offer advice for individuals and families to make the sort of informed decisions within the systems that they're already living in, but you already sort of alluded to this idea that maybe the systems could change. Are there, maybe there are things that we could do that would make parenting easier and better across the board? And so I was curious if you had particular policy kind of initiatives in mind, whether it's in health or education or something where you think we could change the system so that people had an easier time navigating the system.
I think here, actually, it's really important to make a very crucial separation between sort of what, like, almost where these conversations are happening and where the policies matter. So I have a lot of conversations with people about like, how can I do optimal things? Like, how can I sort of optimize around my kid, and how can I like make exactly the right choices for their education, exactly the right choices? And like, in some ways, so much of what I spend my time telling people is like, once you have come to ask me this, you're already doing the core things that actually really matter. Like, your kid has enough to eat, they have a stable place to live, you're probably reading them some books, you're not like, they're not having a lot of adverse childhood experiences. Like, you're already doing it. You're already doing most of the thing, and so like, you're gonna come to me and ask, do I need to rotate the Montessori toys? And it's like, no. It's like not, and so I think there, I almost think there's like this piece where like, we wanna, like, we're sort of thinking in that space about like, how do I do parenting the best? When it's like, you're already kind of, it's like, everything is fine. All of those choices are basically fine. And then there are a lot of people in America and broadly, but in the US, where like we are actually struggling to help them meet some of these more basic needs. And there, I think we can ask, like, what can policy do to help? And so I think there are some things that are pretty straightforward, like paid family leave would be great. That's pretty popular in a bipartisan sense. It doesn't seem to have done anything, but more paid family leave, some support for childcare, for high quality childcare, which is not like $5,000 for each person, because that's not what childcare costs. It is like ongoing support and support for the supply side of childcare. And then I think probably some kind of parenting coaching to sort of help people figure out, what are some of the pretty basic research things we know. So serve and response, like some of this sort of basic stuff that is really implementable, but we kind of haven't told people about. And I think if we could do a little bit more in that direction, I think that's where I would push. That's where I'd push policy.
One thing that I'm not sure if everybody is as familiar with, because you've mostly been in the parenting space, but during COVID, you were very involved in collecting data, and that has led to a lot of data on schools and all sorts of things. And I wanted to know if there's any lessons from the school data that you think are worth sharing on to an audience that may not know that work.
Other than like COVID doesn't spread in schools. You should open schools, they're important. I mean, I've spent a lot of time now in the sort of school test score data and trying to think about what we can learn from that. And the biggest takeaway, if you look at like how kids are doing in tests, is actually sort of back to the last answer, is like how much heterogeneity there is across racial groups, across demographic groups, across locations, and like how kids are doing, and how much there is left to accomplish. In the Detroit public schools, there's like 10% of Black kids are reading at grade level, or like passing the test scores proficient. Like 10% of kids are proficient. That is a fact that like people should just know. Like that's not okay. I basically think like what we get out of this test score data, a lot of it is just like we are failing a big chunk of like America's kids, and I think the data is important partly because I think if we sort of put data like that in people's faces, maybe it will make it more visible what we need to do.
So you started when you were pregnant with Penelope, and she's now a teenager.
Yes.
So now that you have a teenager, it is disturbing. And they're so tall.
They're so tall. I know. She puts on these heels and she's like, "I'm taller than you." I'm like, "You're not taller than me. Not yet. Not yet." Is yours taller?
Oh yeah, I am well beat. I am definitely. I'm gone.
You're behind.
So I was wondering if there are new topics that you are digging into. Because of the place that you're in, and I wonder if there's a book that's going to follow so that all of us know how to raise our teenagers.
I think that raising a teenager is very hard because it is not very amenable to data. It's not. And like there is sort of like when you're dealing with a little kid, there's like a lot of these like I don't know the questions are like more. They're less heterogeneous. Like there are some, in a real crib sheet, it was not hard to outline the chapters. Like you have a baby, like they need to sleep, they need to eat, they are pooping, they gotta eventually poop in the potty. Like basically it's pretty clear what's gonna happen and like where you need to go from A to B. And when you get to an older kid, like the problems they have are more different. And your techniques for dealing with them are kind of like you're constantly trying to reinvent different strategies and figuring out, how to parent someone who like seems like looks like an adult, they're taller than you, but also does not have a fully formed frontal lobe.
Yeah.
And so like, that's and like I have like one amazing parent. Would you like to hear my best parenting strategy?
Yes.
Okay, it's this.
Of course.
It's this. I sit in my kids' rooms are like there's like a den and then there are bedrooms. And in the evening after dinner when they're like getting ready for bed, I just sit in the den on my computer. And then if my daughter happens to come in and say she wants to talk to me, I immediately close my computer and pretend that I like wasn't actually doing something and I'm just there to talk to her. And like if I'm just sitting there, sometimes she will show up. That's it. That's what I have. And it's like really time consuming because it's like I'm like there for 2 hours. It's fine. I mean, I'm working, it's okay. But like it's like that's it. It's just like being there. There's so much more time that you need relative to when they were little, which I find surprising. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I'll not write a book because it would just be that one page.
That's it.
That's it. That's the only tip. I got that from someone else too. They already have a book about it, so it's like I'm done.
So we have a few more minutes before I'm going to turn to before we're going to let the audience here join in with some questions. But we also had some of our Zoom questions come in, and so I thought I would be able to ask a couple of those for our audience at home. And there were a few themes that kind of came through. One I liked a lot, which is basically just to remember that we're in lots of roles other than parenting roles. And so one of the questions was specifically, any advice for grandparents, mothers-in-law in particular?
Oh, yeah.
Which I enjoyed.
Yeah, I have, oh my God, so much.
And this isn't necessarily just for your mother-in-law.
Right. My mother-in-law is wonderful and wouldn't listen to me if I said, which is perhaps the point. I think I would say the best, I mostly hear from the children-in-law about what they wish. And I think that the main thing they wish is to not hear advice. And so maybe zip it. But I actually think one thing is that I would say is like people are often willing to hear a piece of advice once, but don't say it multiple times. I think that's the best. Like you've said your thing, you said what you think, don't say it again.
I would like to also, I think.
Do you have some advice?
No, I was going to say for seminars, I think that's another good. You asked your question.
Don't ask it again.
And that was it. You got your chance.
You got your chance. You just get one. Just get one.
Another person wrote in saying, parenting 101 strategies don't work for me. My kids are neurodivergent. How can I keep my cool amidst standard parenting advice? And I think you help people a lot with this.
I think that's a very hard space, and I think some of it is about finding, and I think this is true no matter what is the sort of particular thing with your kid, is sort of finding a source or a method or something, whether it is like, a book or your, like the provider they're using, that like find something that is going to work for you and then try to keep that. Like, it is very easy on the internet to be influenced by the latest, like, if only you did this thing, you would immediately fix your problem. And that is definitely not true, almost always. And so I think just sort of figuring out something that is going to work for your family and then trying not to be influenced by the other random stuff that people are telling you to do on the internet is about the best you can do. Mm-hmm. So.
A lot of people wanted to know about screen time.
Yeah, did they? Did they?
Yeah, they did.
Okay.
How are you going to solve this?
Solve it. There's two different screen time issues. I think there's a like narrow, fairly simple to solve screen time issue, and then a harder one. So I think on the narrow issue is like, what do I do about screen time with like sort of passive screen time with my small children? Like, how should I navigate like my 3-year-old's consumption of Ms. Rachel? Miss Rachel? I don't know, my kids are too old for Miss Rachel. Anyway, so how should I navigate that? And I think I have like a very simple way for people to think about this, which is just when your kids are watching screens, they are not doing something else. And there's various other things that are valuable and you want to have in your day, like probably having a meal and sleeping and being outside and when they get a little older doing their homework and sort of thinking about like those are things you want. And then screen time is also part of your day, but you should plan when the screen time is. And it should not interfere with the things that are more important. So, if your kid is watching screens instead of sleeping, that's bad because they need to sleep. And so sort of, if you kind of think of screen time as like not a good or not a bad, it's like part of your, like thinking about in advance, this is when the screen time is going to appear in our family's life, and this is the limits we're going to put on it, and then holding those limits. It's not that it's easy to do those things, but like that is a good framework that can work and can generate a relationship with screen time that you are comfortable with. Then there's phones. And then your kid is older and they want access to phones. And John Haidt said that if you give your kid access to phones, they're going to have a mental health problem. And I think this is basically where a lot of people on older kids are. I think that's hard because I really think John is great. I think he has overstated the like quality of the evidence about the relationship between phones and mental health. It's sort of like come out to seem like the entire rise in mental health problems for kids are exclusively due to Instagram. And like I think that's an overstatement of how important Instagram is. But also, it's pretty clear that like some aspects of these things are not good. And so it is a very hard thing to have advice on, other than to say like you are the parent and you have to be willing to set boundaries. But also somehow like teach your kid to eventually set their own boundaries. I don't know.
No, that's good.
Which is not very easy.
Maybe I'll give the final Zoom question, and so then we can turn to the audience after this one. Was someone wrote in saying, I'm going from 1 to 2 kiddos in July. Best
Nice.
tips?
Prepare your partner. I actually think that if there is like one sort of more defaulty parent, when you have, or even if there's not, like when you have 1 kid, one person can be off at any given time. And when you have 2 kids, particularly at the beginning, no one can ever be off. And I think that is a difficult adjustment. So I think there's nothing particular, like you already have the stuff. Like the second kid's usually easier than the first because it's like, you kind of know the situation. But I would say prepare your marriage. Don't worry about your house. Amazon Prime can deliver stuff if you forget.
Very good. I think we're now ready to open it up to the audience. So if you are interested, raise your hand, and we have people. That was very fast. I love that. We have mics coming so that you can ask your question.
Thank you. I've given a lot of parenting advice myself in a 30-plus year as a pediatrician, and I agree with you that much of what we tell parents is style and not really important and lots of choices.
Sure.
And you were asked at the beginning, what's the one thing that you would share? And you said allergen introduction. Yeah. And there's another thing I would like you to say.
Which is?
People are dying of measles in this country.
Oh, yeah. So I would say in the book, in Crib Sheet, which I wrote before we had so much measles, I talk about like the sort of 2 big, like here's what to do chapters are like vaccines and trying to talk people down. I spent a lot of time, obviously, like trying to talk to people about like what is going on with the measles vaccine, how they should be, how they should think about measles vaccine safety. I think, so yeah, like yes.
And not just the measles vaccines sure. In general.
Yes, I spend a lot of time talking about vaccines in general, and I think
you have a platform,
and I spend
really
so much of my time on that platform talking about how people should vaccinate and misinformation about vaccination. And I think that there is like a lot of, I think there's a lot of space to convince people if we, hear out their concerns and try to like meet them where they are. So yes, I will say I really do spend quite a lot of time on my platform talking about measles and other vaccines. I promise.
Thank you.
Hi.
Sorry.
How do you?
Yeah. Hello. Sorry. It's like, where is this?
How do you teach a teenager or a child to find out what is correct, what is true today? Some information can be found out in an Emily Oster book. Some information can be found out on Wikipedia. Some by asking ChatGPT, for instance. But these days, there's so much just sources of information. How do you teach somebody, a kid, which one of these sources is the correct source or something like that?
I think it's interesting. No one has ever asked me that, which is good. I think part of what's hard about this, I think there generally is not like it's not that you could point to like the encyclopedia of the sky and be like, this is always where you can look. I think what we can teach kids is, here are some trusted sources, and here is like a general sense of like, where to look for information. And then I think we can teach them the core thing, which is like, you should probably never have just one source of information, and sort of here is how you like engage with generating knowledge and almost like checking what your sources are, because I think ultimately the way that we get to understand the truth on a lot of things is to kind of like see what the other side says. And so there's some piece in there. But I don't know, that's a very hard question. Hard and good.
So my question is related to balancing autonomy and safety, especially when your partner and yourself have perhaps different ideas of the ideal balance.
Okay, that's hard. I mean, I think there's a sort of generic piece of advice here, which you probably know, but I will repeat, which is like having those conversations in a moment in which you are ready to have the conflict and like try to get to a solution is going to be more effective than having the conversation with your partner when you are disagreeing about what the person is doing right this very second. And so I think like as much as possible, sort of confronting that disagreement and saying like, okay, like, you know, we are trying to do this activity of raising this person together, and like let's actually try to figure out, can we come to a compromise on this? Because if you don't, then you will just have this conflict over and over again. Then there's a question of like, what is the evidence about sort of balancing safety and autonomy? And I think this is something almost everybody struggles, like a lot of parents struggle a lot with, in part because it's very easy to see the safety risks. And it's very hard to see the risks of not letting your kids do things, particularly in the physical world, right? This sort of like, it's easy to see why I would be afraid to let my kid walk home from school by themselves. And it seems like I'm trading that, like, you know, that risk against like a not risk. And the sort of phrasing of like no option is completely safe can sometimes be helpful to sort of think about like the option of never allowing your kid to do this also has some risks of like, you know, they're a little more vague and existential and developmental as opposed to like literally like they're gonna fall down and scrape themselves, and you know, but they're recognizing the risks of the other option is sometimes a helpful frame. And I will also say, I don't know which side of the like autonomy safety you are on, but for many people, taking tiny steps is helpful. So if you think like, let's let our 6-year-old walk home from school by themselves, and your partner is like, are you kidding? We're going to be walking them home until they're 18. Maybe the first step is like, why don't we meet them a half a block closer to school, or why don't we let them go to the end of the driveway? And just if there's a little bit, because the first time you do something like that, it's very scary, and the third time you do it, it's not scary. And that adaptation can sort of slowly build into maybe something that you're both comfortable with.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about a time when you read the data one way and then later changed your mind, and how you handled that and what about it changed your mind.
You mean if I read the data and then new data came out, or I ultimately decided that like the data wasn't the way I had read it in the first place?
The second one.
There are times in my academic work when I've made like mistakes and sort of like one very public one very early in my career, which was closest to that. But I don't think that has, and that was like a very embarrassing thing where I should have been more careful at the time. I don't think that has happened in the parenting data space. New data has come out. There certainly have been cases like whether you can sleep on your back during pregnancy, where like the data has kind of flip-flopped some over time, but sort of like I thought that the data said this, and then when I read it again, and I sort of said that publicly, and then when I read it again, I thought it was different. I do not think that has happened, and I'm not probably once I leave, I'm gonna be like, oh, I should have. I'm gonna keep thinking.
Hi. So you said you have a lot of data from COVID times. So yeah. There's the disease itself, but then there was also the mental health impact of the social isolation, particularly for teens, preteens in that cohort. So I had a teen who was ready to graduate high school, and I also had a preteen, and their development was significantly different. The preteen was more impacted mental health-wise. So do you see any obvious data about mental health? And
I don't think we have seen what we will eventually see about this. I mean, you can sort of look at mental health trends over time. We definitely saw some blips up in the pandemic. It's basically returned to the upward trend that we sort of saw pre-pandemic. So I think there are a bunch of questions like this which remain unanswered, and my guess is we will sort of answer a bit more of them over time. But the kind of blip up during the pandemic doesn't seem to have persisted. It basically went back down, and then there's been a sort of trend in deteriorating mental health for quite a long time.
Thank you.
I think here we have one.
For older kids, how do you separate nature from nurture when you collect data and analyze data?
Oh, it's like
besides just collecting huge amount of data.
I think even collecting a huge amount of data is basically impossible. I mean, like many of the questions that we would have about older kids, about sort of like what determines success, like how do I determine, like we will have no idea because there's so many different factors and there are so many different inputs, and the things that happen are so rich and varied, and kids are so different that I think this is part of why Jane asked, like, are you going to write another book? And I think part of the reason, like older kids are really hard, is the data is just really, really poor. It's already not that great when we talk about 2-year-olds. By the time you're talking about 17-year-olds, like we're kind of done. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you for coming over here. So I had a question on the involvement of like grandparents. So if you look at the word parenting, it was never in the dictionary until like the 70s.
Totally.
And I didn't believe it, but when I went and looked at a 1968 copy, it turned out it was right. So there was no word of parenting. And the theory is that the involvement of grandparents has come down. So people have started looking for like parenting strategies because back in the day there was always help required. So my question is, what do you see in the research about involvements of like grandparents, and how has the research outcomes changed? And do you see any good or bad trend because of that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we have seen a decline in multifamily households over time, and so the sort of that kind of grandparenting and involvement, which of course, like in a kind of historical, like evolutionary space-time, was obviously very, very, very important in some sense. Like that, I mean, the importance of grandparents is sort of why like women survive past past reproductive age. Basically, I mean, it kind of has to be, and so. Over the more recent past, people have sort of nuclear families have become more important. There's more mobility. People have moved away from grandparents, and so I think that is a trend. I am not sure that's why the sort of parenting as it is currently practiced has become more important. But certainly this like move away from the nuclear family is something that has. Or move away from grandparents is something that has happened over time. The other thing that's happened, I think, is to sort of emphasize this shift, is that people are having kids older, and so their parents are older. And if you think like basically grandma's job is going to be taking care of, like my mom's going to take care of the baby. If I'm 40, if she's 40 when she had me, and I'm 40 when I have my kid, she's 80, and like that's not going to work. Right, and that's, or at least depending on the person, that's going to be tough. And so I think that's another piece of this that's just become more difficult to have that be like your core childcare.
Hi. So I just wondered if you could, if there are any spaces where you think that maybe like you might not rely on evidence-based decision making, but I don't know, something like intuition or value-based decisions might happen. And I'm not maybe thinking so much of parenting, but just other areas that you've looked at.
I think every decision has to involve your values and preferences. I mean, this is kind of the like, but people will sometimes say this as if it is in conflict with the idea of using evidence, and I think that's not the way I would think about it. So if someone says like, I am just doing this because of my gut, the way I read that as an economist is my preference for this is very strong. And so in some sense, you could still say, like, I'm going to look at the data, and I'm going to sort of think about what the data says, but then I'm going to combine it with my preferences. And it really, like, my preference for this is really, really strong. And even though I see that having an epidural is terrible, I'm still gonna do it because I hate like that's not a good example. But I think there's sort of cases in which people would say look, I looked at this, but I decided I really want to do this other thing. And I think that's a totally reasonable set of choices, and in fact exactly how we should be making decisions. I always think it is valuable to have the evidence, even if you were going to say my preference dominates. And so I don't actually think that decisions based on intuition are sort of some kind of alternative to evidence-based decisions.
So thank you so much, Emily, for being here today. This has been really helpful. So I remember reading during the midst of the pandemic that one of the unfortunate things was the educational development loss in children due to shutting down of schools, or once they finally opened, it's more virtual versus in place.
Yeah.
So if I'd love to hear your opinions on or kind of what policies have you really pushed for in order to kind of recoup some of those losses during the COVID pandemic times, and also just with the advent of AI and all these really great AI educational focused solutions, do you think that could be played, or those could play a role in helping to recoup some of those losses? Thank you.
Yeah. So when we look at the COVID pandemic losses, the sort of virtual schooling was very bad for the initial losses, and then sort of subsequently there's been a fair amount of variation in how much recovery there has been, and so there's a lot of variation across states in how much recovery they have seen, which actually is largely unrelated to their pandemic schooling mode. So the amount that they've recovered just doesn't, you lost more if you didn't open your schools, but the recovery doesn't seem to relate too much to that loss. There are some places that have been much more successful than others, and I'm not sure we have a great sense of why, but to give you an example, there's a huge amount of variation in ELA, in English language arts. So we have English language arts and math. Every place in math is crawling itself back at a slow rate. And in English language arts, we have states like Massachusetts, which actually is substantially worse off than they were even right after the pandemic, and states like South Carolina, which is substantially better off, or Mississippi, substantially better off than they were before the pandemic. So we're seeing big variations in recovery. I don't think we have a great sense of what's going on there. One thing that sort of shows up in a casual read of the data, which I think in some ways relates to your second point, is some places have been teaching reading with phonics and some places have not, and the places that have been teaching reading with phonics for a longer period of time have recovered more quickly. For me, that actually speaks a little bit to some of these AI questions, because I actually think the problems that we're having, kids not being able to read, are not really going to be solved by AI. They are just going to be solved by coming up with a better reading curriculum and having enough people to teach the kids to read. And then from there, they can be equipped to sort of engage with AI. But I almost think we're having problems that are before the AI problems, and it would be great to use AI for ed tech, and I think there's a lot of interesting promise there. But if you can't read, you can't engage with the AI because you can't write in questions. And so let's get the reading first, and then we can talk about GPT.
Hello. It's exciting to ask you a question face-to-face on Q&A
Is
Wednesday.
it just I know, it's just like Instagram.
This is a very personal question. I'm due in August.
Congratulations.
And thank you. Vaccine hesitant family who will be visiting from across the country to help out, one of which is an educator. And so I am wondering your advice on where the hard line may be, even though it could be personal preference, for vaccines to really push for people to get, and in the first 6 months or so.
Most of the vaccines, so there's two kinds of the vaccine hesitancy that I would sort of think about here. One is I've got a bunch of but if you have a bunch of nieces and nephews who don't have any of their routine childhood vaccines, and I think that is a place I'd draw a pretty hard line for the first several months at least, because you really don't want a baby with measles and you don't want a baby with pertussis. If what we're talking about is we have older family members who don't want to get the COVID vaccine, who don't want to get a Tdap booster, who don't want to get a flu vaccine, I think the sterilizing immunity of those is less strong, and so the sort of arguments against having them are less strong. If I had to push for one of those, I'd push for flu, basically.
So when I was a kid, I learned cursive.
Oh yeah, me too. What a disaster, right? You use that at all?
I use it all the time.
Do you?
Yes,
Oh
I
my God.
usually have notes. Like I usually
good
take
Lord.
notes and everything.
Okay.
And I got to walk to school, so I mapped. And things that I have an 18-month-old, things I've read about is one is like the creative nature of cursive and how you're using a different part of your brain as opposed to either printing or also typing. And then to the other point of like mapping your environment, where either we're not letting kids go out far enough to really have that spatial awareness, or even something like Google Maps, which is mapping things for us. And so is there anything on that kind of, I don't exactly know the question, but like the impacts of things like writing cursive or mapping your environment, that like those kind of behavioral, like I said, I'm not exactly sure the question because I don't understand the depth of it, but.
Yeah, I mean, there are pieces of this. So the mapping environment is for sure true, and we know from like studies on London cabbies that basically sort of show, you can sort of see the way that their brains have like mapped things is different because you have to memorize all of the cabbie routes or whatever in London. And so I think it's for sure true that people over time have developed less of that set of neuronal pathways that like would be appropriate for mapping. Not so much because they don't walk to school, but just because everyone is using Google Maps all the time, and like they can't get back to their house without like from 3 blocks away without Google Maps. And so, you could sort of say, is that a problem? It's sort of only a problem if you think there's something particularly special about that mapping, which I'm not sure that we know enough about the brain to know that that's true. And I would say the sort of same thing for cursive. I have never seen any data on the relationship between cursive and creativity. It's for sure true that if you look at the brain, like if you sort of said, I'm going to teach somebody cursive for 6 weeks and have them really focus on it, I'm going to run them through an fMRI like before and after, you're going to see things that change in their brain. But whether those are important, I think that's like, we just don't know. Like it's, there's a lot of plasticity in your brain. Like
You might find something else.
maybe typing is going to be good for some other thing. I don't know.
I think we have time for one more question. Sorry to make you choose.
First, I want to say thank you. I was pregnant for the first time in COVID, and you were so helpful for kind of trying to parse through all the noise. So I have a two-part question. My first is, when you were starting your research for all of your books, is there something where you're like, surely the deli meat thing is true, and you found out that was, the evidence convinced you otherwise? And then is there some conventional wisdom now that you really feel like you want to dig into and challenge?
So what was the most surprising? I was surprised, the sort of vague sense of where listeria comes from, I found surprising. Like I thought that listeria would be like more concentrated. And then when I started looking at like where listeria is, it was just so many different random places. So that was sort of like one moment of sort of early on where I was like, oh, okay. I did not expect that, although there were many surprises during pregnancy. Is there conventional wisdom I would like to think about now? I don't know. My brain is so often in sort of older kid land these days. I'm not sure I have any. I'm not sure I have any conventional wisdom that I want to debunk right now.
All right, I am going to have to pause things here, even though I know there are many more of you in the room with questions, but for the sake of time, we're going to have to end here. We will be back next year in the fall and the winter and the spring with our Think Better series with a wonderful set of speakers. But for now, I just want to again thank the people in the room who came out in person, thank everyone on Zoom who joined, and most importantly, one last chance for us to thank Emily for coming and being with us. Thank you.